Out on the Mustang Plains, where the wind carries secrets and justice rides alone, one old man and one bruised girl stood against the full weight of a crooked law. This wasn't a story born in courtrooms or council halls. It was carved in blood, dust, and grit. When Elijah Cole stepped between Annie and the man who called himself her kin, he didn't just take in a child, he lit a fuse. What followed was betrayal, fire, and the kind of courage only found at the barrel of a rifle. This is the story of how a grieving cowboy became a father again, how a frightened girl became fireproof, and how a dying ranch turned into a fortress of hope. And if that doesn't stir your heart just a little, check if it's still beating. What did you think of today's story? If it brought you any warmth or made you smile even for a second, drop a simple "good" in the comments below. Got your own thoughts or feelings? I'd love to hear them seriously. And hey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It's free, and it truly helps us grow this space for stories that matter. Thanks so much for being here. The wind, a raw and restless spirit, clawed at Elijah Cole's weathered face, whipping dust from the parched Texas soil across the sprawling, empty acres of his ranch. 51 years had carved their history into him, etched in the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw, a history now dominated by a silence as vast as the land itself. It was a silence that amplified the ghost. 2 winters? 2 long, brutal winters since Mary Beth had faded, her breath growing shallow as the illness stole her away. Bit by agonizing bit, the memory was a raw wound, still weeping. And Samuel? God. Samuel, the echo of his boy's laughter, bright and untamed as a Mustang colt, still rang in the hollows of Elijah's heart, a cruel counterpoint to the thud of a spooked horse, and a silence that had fallen thereafter, absolute and final. If only I could have held you back, son. The thought was a constant, rasping whisper in his soul, a penance he paid with every solitary dawn. His days were a ritual of staving off decay, his own and the ranch's, mending fences that seemed to sag under the weight of his grief, tending the meager herd that remained. Ghosts, too, of a once thriving operation. The silence was his companion, heavy, suffocating, each hammer blow against a warped plank, each creak of the windmill was an intrusion, quickly swallowed by the oppressive quiet. The trip to redemption, the nearest smudge of a town, was a necessity, not a desire. A recent storm, one of the prairie's sudden furies, had ripped the door clean off the old barn. With the rainy season looming, a black-bellied threat on the horizon, he needed lumber, and needed it fast. He'd loaded the wagon at first light, the air still cool and carrying the scent of distant rain and despair. Redemption. The name was a bitter joke. The town itself felt choked, its clappered buildings hunched against the ever-present wind. Folks moved with a guarded weariness, eyes downcast, as if every soul carried a secret too heavy to bear, a burden they dared not share. Elijah felt the familiar prickle of distaste. He wasn't one for towns, for the press of people and their silent judgments. He preferred the honesty of the land. However harsh, he pulled the wagon up before the General Mercantile, the largest and sorriest excuse for a supplier in a 50-mile radius. That's when he saw her, a wisp of a girl, maybe 15 summers. Though her eyes held the ancient weariness of 100, she was thin to the point of fragility, her dress a collection of faded patches, sleeves too short for her bony arms. She wrestled with a broom easily twice her size, trying to sweep the dust-deviled porch, a task as futile as trying to hold back the tide. Her face, smudged with dirt, was a canvas of old and new bruises, a purpled shadow blooming beneath one eye, the faint white line of an older scar tracing her jaw. She moved with a grim resignation, a creature broken to the yoke. Elijah's first instinct was to look away, to load his lumber and retreat to the familiar desolation of his ranch. He had enough ghosts of his own. He didn't need to take on anyone else's. He tied off the reins, his gaze fixed on the splintered sign above the store. Jasper Hale. Prop? He grunted. Hale? Apt name for a man who'd likely bring nothing but trouble. Then, a harsh, grating voice ripped through the thin air from inside the store. You lazy whelp. What in damnation are you doing out there? Sweep. Damn you. Don't just stand there looking like a stunned calf. Jasper Hale himself emerged, a gaunt, stoop-shouldered man swimming in clothes too big for his frame. His face was sallow, his eyes bloodshot and mean, the sour reek of stale whiskey preceding him like a herald. He punctuated his tirade with a vicious shove that sent the girl stumbling, the oversized broom clattering to the warped planks. She whimpered, a small, animal sound of fear, and scrambled to retrieve the broom. Her shoulders hunched as if expecting another blow. Elijah had seen enough. The weariness in his bones warred with a sudden, cold anger. He straightened, his 51 years settling into a solidity that had faced down blizzards and bandits alike. He couldn't ignore this. Not this. Hey. His voice was low, a rumble that carried the weight of the prairie, cutting through Jasper's alcohol-fueled vitriol. Jasper whirled, eyes narrowed, a sneer twisting his thin lips. What's it to you? Cole, mind your own damn business. Get. Before I lose my temper. Elijah's gaze, hard as flint, flicked from Jasper to the trembling girl, then back. That your daughter? He asked, his tone deceptively mild, yet a current of something dangerous ran beneath it. What if she is? Jasper spat, his hand twitching. Don't concern you none. Now, I said. Geet, you raise a girl, you don't beat her. Elijah stated, the words flat, unequivocal. To me, that makes it my business. A flicker of something. Surprise. Fear. Crossed Jasper's face, quickly masked by a belligerent fury. He laughed. A harsh, ugly sound. My property. Cole. I do with it as I please. He raised his hand, aiming to strike the cowering girl. Before the blow could land, Elijah moved, not fast, but with an undeniable certainty. His larger, calloused hand shot out, clamping around Jasper's bony wrist like a vice. Jasper yelped, his eyes widening as he felt the power in that grip. You dare lay a hand on me, Jasper hissed, trying to wrench his arm free, his face contorting with a mixture of rage and sudden, dawning apprehension. Elijah's eyes were chips of winter ice. Try touching that girl again, he said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. Just try it. I'll show you what happens when a man mistakes cruelty for strength. The pressure on Jasper's wrist increased infinitesimally, and the smaller man winced, a bead of sweat tracing a path through the grime on his temple. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a sullen, craven fear. He knew Cole's reputation, a quiet man, but one who'd buried more than his share of trouble. Jasper Hale mumbled a string of curses, his bravado shriveling under Elijah's unblinking stare. He yanked his arm free as Elijah loosened his grip, then scuttled back into the dim interior of the store, slamming the door behind him with a force that rattled the window panes. The sound echoed the finality of a coffin lid closing. Silence descended again, broken only by the girl's ragged breathing. Annie, for that was surely her name, or one like it, stood frozen, clutching the broom handle so tight her knuckles were white. A fresh trickle of blood welled from a split in her lip, stark against her pale skin. An old, faded scar, a silvery track on her forearm, spoke of earlier brutalities. Elijah let out a long, slow breath. He hadn't come to town looking for this added weight to the burdens he already carried. But he couldn't turn his back. He saw Mary Beth's gentleness in the girl's fear, Samuel's stolen youth in her haunted eyes. A man couldn't just walk away from that, not if he still wanted to call himself a man. He looked at the girl, his expression softening, though the hardness didn't entirely leave his eyes. What's your name, child? She flinched at his direct address, her gaze darting from his face to the ground and back again. Annie. Sir? She whispered, the word barely audible, raspy from disuse or fear. You got any other Annie, anyone who'd take you in. She shook her head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, her eyes fixed on the dusty toes of her worn-out shoes. Elijah considered. The ranch was no place for a child, especially a girl. It was harsh, lonely, but it was safer than here, under Jasper Hale's fist. You know how to ride a horse. A small nod this time, a flicker of something that might have been surprise in her eyes. He made his decision. It settled on him, heavy and irrevocable, like the Texas sky before a storm. You'll come with me. Annie's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief, and a dawning, fragile hope that was almost painful to witness. What, sir? But he won't let me go, Jasper. Elijah's jaw tightened. He tries to stop you, he said, his voice resonating with cold, hard certainty. I'll plant him where he stands. Get your things, child. If you got anything to get. Annie just stared, as if he'd spoken in a foreign tongue. Things, she repeated. A hollow echo? Elijah understood. He turned to the store, his shadow falling long across the porch. He didn't bother knocking. He pushed the door open. Jasper was behind the counter, pretending to arrange some tins, but his hands trembled. The storekeeper, a man named Silas, who always looked like he'd swallowed a sour pickle, watched from the corner, eyes wide. The girl's leaving with me, Elijah announced, his voice leaving no room for argument. She got any wages due. Jasper glared, but the fight was gone from him. Wages. For that lazy, she owes me for her keep. She's paid her keep in bruises, Elijah said, his voice flat. He glanced around. Got any boots that'll fit her? And a hat. Put 'em on Hale's account. If he objects. Elijah's eyes met Jasper's. He can take it up with me later. Silas, eager to avoid being caught in the crossfire, scurried to find some worn but serviceable boots and a plain, wide-brimmed hat. Annie, who had followed Elijah to the doorway like a stray dog unsure of a kindness, watched with stunned, uncomprehending eyes as Elijah paid Silas from his own lean purse for the items, not trusting Hale for a damn thing. He wouldn't indebt the girl to that man for even a pair of cast-off boots. He handed them to Annie. Put these on. The trail's rough. She fumbled with the boots, her thin fingers clumsy. The hat, when she placed it on her head, was too big, but it shaded her bruised face, giving her an odd, waifish dignity. She had nothing else. No bundle of clothes. No treasured keepsake. Just the rags on her back and the new, terrifying hope in her eyes. Elijah bought his lumber. The transaction curt and efficient, he loaded it onto the wagon, Annie watching him with a quiet intensity. When he was done, he looked at her. Ready, she nodded. A quick, jerky movement. For the first time, he saw a flicker of something other than fear in her eyes. It might have been resilience. It might have been the first faint glimmer of a light that had been almost extinguished. He helped her onto the wagon seat, his touch surprisingly gentle. As they pulled away from redemption, neither looked back. The wind picked up, tugging at Annie's new hat, and Elijah Cole, a man who thought he'd lost everything worth having, felt a strange, unfamiliar stirring in the desolate landscape of his heart. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was something. A purpose, a responsibility, a fragile new beginning, sprung from the ashes of an ending too brutal to bear alone. The ride back to the ranch was a long, slow unwinding of tension, at least for Elijah. For Annie, perched precariously behind him on his horse, the big gelding's gait, a jarring rhythm she wasn't used to. It was a different story. She clung to the saddle horn with a white-knuckled grip, her small body stiff, a bundle of tightly wound nerves and fear. Each creak of leather, each snort from the horse, seemed to make her jump. The vast, open prairie, stretching away in an endless expanse of sun-baked grass and distant mesas, likely felt more like a terrifying void than a path to safety. Elijah kept his silence. He knew the girl needed space, a wide berth to let the poison of Jasper Hale's cruelty seep out of her system. Words wouldn't do much good now. He could feel her light weight, the occasional tremor that ran through her. He remembered another small form, trusting and warm, that used to ride with him, Samuel's thin arms around his waist. The memory was a dull ache, a familiar companion. He pushed it down. This wasn't Samuel. This was Annie, and she needed something different from him than what his son had. The sun beat down, relentless. Dust rose from the horse's hooves, coating them both in a fine, gritty powder. Elijah offered her the canteen a couple of times. She took it with a mumbled, "Thank ye, sir," her eyes darting to his face for a fleeting second before skittering away. She drank sparingly, as if afraid to take too much. He didn't press. Patience, he told himself. This was like gentling a spooked filly, slow and steady. They reached the ranch as the sun began to bleed crimson and orange across the western sky, painting the harsh landscape in hues of deceptive beauty. The cabin was small, built of rough-hewn timber, but it stood solid against the wind. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a thin, welcoming plume. He'd banked the fire before leaving. "We're here," he said, his voice sounding loud in the quiet. He swung down, then reached up to help her. She practically fell into his arms, her legs unsteady. For a moment, she leaned against him, all sharp angles and trembling exhaustion, before quickly pulling away, a flush rising on her dirt-streaked cheeks. The house, though simple, was clean. Mary Beth had insisted on that. Even when the sickness had her weak, her touch was still there, in the faded but scrubbed curtains, the neatly stacked firewood, the worn but polished table. "This'll be your room," he said, gesturing to a small alcove off the main room, barely big enough for a narrow cot and a small, three-legged stool. It had a window, though, looking out onto the prairie. "Water's from the well out back. Outhouse is yonder. Barn's where we keep the tools and horses." Their first meals were quiet affairs. Annie ate like a starving bird, pecking at the jerky and beans he'd prepared, her eyes constantly moving, as if expecting Jasper to burst through the door. Elijah didn't force conversation or food. He just ate, his presence steady, a silent reassurance that this place, at least, was safe. He noticed how she cradled the tin cup of water, how her gaze lingered on the small, mended patch on his sleeve. She was taking it all in, piece by piece, slowly, tentatively. Annie began to find her place. She was clumsy at first, her movements jerky and unsure, chopping wood for the stove. She'd miss more often than hit, feeding the few chickens. She'd scatter more feed than they ate. But she watched Elijah, her gaze intense, focused. She saw how he held the axe, the rhythm of his swing. She saw how he mended a broken latch on the corral. His hands, though large and calloused, moving with surprising dexterity. And she learned, one afternoon, he found her struggling to drive a nail into a loose fence post, her small face set in fierce concentration. The nail was bent, the wood around it splintered. He came up beside her, not speaking at first, just watching. "You're trying too hard and not hard enough," he said finally, his voice gruff but not unkind. He took the hammer from her. "Hold it firmer, near the end, like this." He demonstrated. "Keep your eye on the nail head, not the hammer, and swing smooth. Don't be afraid to mar the wood. There's plenty of wood. It's the nail that needs to go straight." He let her try again. She missed, then hit it glancingly. "Again," he said. She took a breath, and this time, the nail went in, a little crooked, but in a tiny smile, quick as a hummingbird's wing, touched her lips before she suppressed it. He taught her other things, small things that made up a life on the edge of nowhere. How to bank a fire so it would last the night. How to spot the tracks of a jackrabbit or a coyote. How to read the clouds for signs of rain. He showed her how Mary Beth used to mend his work shirts, the small, neat stitches that held the fabric together. Annie's first attempts were a mess of tangled thread and uneven seams, but she persisted, her brow furrowed in concentration. One morning, while checking the fence line, Elijah saw her crouched near a post. She was looking at something, her expression soft. A single, stubborn bluebonnet had pushed its way through the dry earth, a splash of defiant color in the muted landscape. She reached out a finger, gently touched a petal, then quickly drew back as if she'd been caught doing something wrong. Elijah saw it all. He didn't say anything, but a warmth, unexpected and unfamiliar, spread through his chest. It was the first time he'd seen her look at something with anything other than fear or grim determination. The silence between them began to fill with small sounds, small questions. "Mr. Cole, why do the cattle huddle like that before a storm?" Or, "Mr. Cole, that hawk, is it looking for snakes?" Her voice was still quiet, but the tremor was mostly gone. She started calling him Mr. Elijah sometimes, then just Elijah. The first time so hesitantly, he almost hadn't registered it. One evening, the wind howled outside, a mournful sound that rattled the window panes. Elijah was oiling a bridle, the familiar scent of leather and oil filling the small cabin. Annie sat by the fire, carefully mending one of her own ragged sleeves with thread he'd given her. The needle was clumsy in her small fingers, but she was patient. "Your wife?" she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "What was she like, sir?" "Mr. Elijah." Elijah's hands stilled. He looked into the dancing flames. the past flickering there like ghosts. He hadn't spoken of Mary Beth to anyone. Not really. Since she'd gone, she was kind, he said after a long moment, his voice thick and strong, stronger than anyone I ever knew. Sickness took her. He swallowed, the words like stones in his throat. He found himself talking then, a little about Mary Beth's garden, her laughter, and then, hesitantly, about Samuel, about the boy's quick smile, his fascination with horses, the bright spark of him that had been so cruelly extinguished. He didn't say much, just fragments, shards of memory. Annie listened, her eyes fixed on his face, her own small, scarred hands still in her lap. There was no pity in her gaze, but a deep, quiet understanding that went beyond words. She knew loss, she knew pain. In that shared, unspoken knowledge, a fragile bond was forged. The peace, however, was as tenuous as a desert bloom. It was a hot, still afternoon a few weeks later when trouble rode in. 2 horses, kicking up dust. Elijah recognized Jasper Hale instantly, his weaselly face contorted in a snarl. The man beside him was bigger, broader, with a tin star pinned to his vest. Sheriff Buck Hale, Jasper's older brother, a man known for his quick temper and his tendency to see things his brother's way. Elijah stepped onto the porch, his stance deceptively relaxed, but his eyes were watchful. Annie, who'd been feeding the chickens, froze, then scurried to stand just inside the cabin door, her face pale. "Cole?" Jasper spat, reining in his horse so hard it shied. "Where's that brat? You kidnapped her, you damn thief." Elijah's gaze was level. "She's not livestock to be kidnapped, Jasper. She came of her own will. You abused her. That's the truth of it." Sheriff Hale swung down from his horse, his movements heavy, deliberate. He hitched his gun belt. "Be that as it may, Cole," he said, his voice a low growl, authoritative and smug. "The law's clear. A minor child stays with her legal guardian. Jasper here," he jerked a thumb at his brother, "is her stepfather. He's got the papers to prove it." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "A guardian to beat her half to death, to work her like a slave. Maybe you ought to ask the girl herself where she wants to be, Sheriff. Or does the law not care about that?" As if on cue, Annie stepped out from the doorway. She was trembling, but she moved to stand just behind Elijah, her small hand reaching out, clutching the back of his worn cotton shirt. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. The sheriff's eyes, hard and unsympathetic, fixed on her. "Now, little lady," he said, his voice falsely gentle, like a predator soothing its prey. "Your pa here has come for you. You want to go back with him, don't you? Back to your home." Annie flinched at the word. "Pa?" But her chin came up a fraction. She looked from Jasper's leering face to the sheriff's impassive one, then up at the solid strength of Elijah's back. "No," she said. Her voice was small, but clear, and firmer than Elijah had ever heard it. She shook her head, a decisive movement. "No, I want to stay here. With Mr. Elijah." Jasper lunged forward with a roar of incoherent rage. "You ungrateful little—" "Hold it, Jasper," the sheriff barked, his hand shooting out to grab his brother's arm. He looked back at Elijah, his eyes cold. "This ain't over, Cole. Not by a long shot. We'll be back. And next time, I'll have a court order." They wheeled their horses and rode off, leaving a cloud of angry dust hanging in the still air. Elijah turned and looked down at Annie. Her face was still pale, but her eyes held a spark of defiance he hadn't seen before. She was still clutching his shirt, her knuckles white. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder. "You did good, Annie," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "You did real good." A tiny, tremulous smile touched her lips. It was a start, but he knew, as he watched the riders disappear over the rise, that the sheriff was right. This was far from over. The cracks had appeared, and the storm was still gathering. The days that followed the sheriff's visit settled into a kind of watchful quiet, the peace of a lull before a promised storm. The air itself seemed to hum with unspoken tension. Elijah knew the Hales wouldn't let it rest. Jasper's bruised ego and the sheriff's affronted authority were a potent, venomous brew. For Annie, the confrontation had been a crucible. She'd faced down her tormentor and his brother, and a new steel had entered her spine. But the fear still lingered in the shadows of her eyes, especially when the wind carried the sound of distant riders. To arm her against that fear, and against whatever might come, Elijah decided it was time. He pulled out the old Winchester rifle, Mary Beth's father's gun, well-oiled and true. "This ain't a toy, Annie," he said, his voice low and serious as he showed her how to load it, how to sight down the long barrel. "And it ain't for looking for trouble, it's for ending it. If it comes looking for you, and there's no other way." He set up some empty cans on a fence post a fair distance off. Annie was a natural. Her hands, though small, were steady. Her eye was sharp. She listened intently to his instructions. "Breathe slow. Squeeze the trigger, don't pull. Account for the wind." Her first few shots were wide, the kick of the rifle jarring her small frame. But she didn't complain. She just reset, her brow furrowed in concentration. By the end of the afternoon, she was consistently hitting the cans. A grim satisfaction settled on Elijah's face. The girl had grit, and in this land, grit was worth more than gold. They worked together to repair the storm-damaged barn door, the one he'd gone to redemption for in the first place. He showed her how to measure the planks, how to use the saw, how to set the hinges true. There was an easy rhythm to their work, a silent understanding that passed between them, handing him tools before he asked, steadying a board while he hammered. It felt right, like fitting a missing piece into a broken hole. He hadn't felt that kind of simple companionship since Mary Beth, in the evenings, by the flickering light of the kerosene lamp. Annie discovered a new world. Mary Beth had a small collection of books tucked away in a wooden crate, a well-thumbed Bible, some Shakespeare, a tattered copy of Pilgrim's Progress, and a few novels with heroic figures and far-off lands. Annie, who'd likely never had the chance to learn much beyond her letters, if that, approached them with a hesitant curiosity that soon blossomed into a fierce hunger. Elijah would watch her, her lips moving silently as she traced the words with a finger, her expression rapt. He encouraged it. "Knowledge is a tool, Annie," he told her, "sometimes the best weapon you got." But the shadow of the law, or what passed for it in Jasper Hale's hands, was never far. It arrived one sun-scorched morning in the form of 3 riders. Sheriff Buck Hale was there, his face set in its usual unpleasant lines. One of his deputies, a shifty-eyed youth named Cletus, rode beside him. But it was the third man who drew Elijah's immediate, wary attention. He was a city man, dressed in a dark, out-of-place suit despite the heat, his face pale and impassive, his eyes like chips of cold slate. He carried a leather satchel and an air of officious, unyielding authority. "Elijah Cole," the stranger announced as they reined in, his voice as flat and devoid of emotion as a tax ledger. He didn't dismount immediately, surveying the modest ranch with a disdainful air. "I am Agent Prescott, from the state capitol, dispatched by the governor's office. We have received formal complaints regarding your illegal detention of a minor child, one Annie Kenner. Reports also cite child endangerment and obstruction of justice." Elijah had moved to the edge of the porch, his posture deceptively casual, but his hand wasn't far from the Colt holstered at his hip. Annie appeared in the doorway behind him, her eyes wide, but her stance resolute. "The girl is safe here, Prescott," Elijah said, his voice dangerously calm, "and she stays of her own free will. If anyone's endangering her, it's those who try to drag her back to the hell Jasper Hale calls a home." Prescott finally swung down from his horse, his movements stiff and precise. He opened his satchel and produced a sheaf of papers. "According to the statutes of this state, Elijah Cole, Annie Kenner is a minor. As such, she does not possess the legal right to self-determination in matters of guardianship. You are not a blood relative, nor have you been appointed her legal guardian by any court. Therefore, she must be remanded to the care and custody of the state until such time as a formal hearing can determine her proper placement." He spoke as if reciting from a manual, his gaze unwavering. Annie stepped forward then, moving to stand beside Elijah, her small hand instinctively finding his arm. The tremor was there, but her voice, when she spoke, was surprisingly strong. "I won't go anywhere with you. I don't trust your laws if they protect men like Jasper Hale and condemn those who try to help." Prescott's cold eyes flicked to her, a flicker of something, annoyance. briefly disturbing his composure. "Young lady," he said, his tone unwavering, "your emotional outbursts, while perhaps understandable, do not alter the legal realities of this situation. This is not a matter for debate or sentiment. It is a matter of law." Elijah felt a cold fury rise within him. This man, with his papers and his pronouncements, knew nothing of the fear in Annie's eyes when she'd first arrived, nothing of the bruises that had mapped her young body. "That so," Elijah said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Then try and take her." The air crackled. Sheriff Hale shifted uncomfortably. The deputy, Cletus, puffed out his chest and took a step forward, his hand reaching for his own sidearm. Elijah didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe, but his eyes locked onto the deputy. His hand moved, a blur, to rest on the worn butt of his Colt. "I'd advise you to think again, son," he said, his voice soft, yet carrying the deadly promise of a rattlesnake's warning. "Real hard." Cletus froze, his bravado draining away like water in sand. He looked to Sheriff Hale, who shot him a glare. Buck Hale knew Elijah Cole. He knew the man was slow to anger, but when roused, he was a force of nature. He put a restraining hand on Prescott's arm. "Hold on, Agent," the sheriff muttered, his voice low enough that Elijah barely caught it, though he knew Annie, beside him, heard every word. "This old coot ain't bluffing. He'll shoot, and he don't often miss. Today ain't the day to push it. Not like this." Prescott's thin lips tightened. He was clearly unaccustomed to being thwarted, especially by what he likely considered a pair of uneducated country folk. But he was no fool. He could read the raw, unyielding determination in Elijah's eyes and the sudden lack of enthusiasm from the sheriff and his deputy. "This is not concluded, Cole," Prescott said, his voice regaining its cold, official tone as he remounted. "You are actively defying a directive from the state. There will be consequences. You are fighting an entire territory, Mr. Cole, a fight you cannot possibly win." They turned their horses, Sheriff Hale avoiding Elijah's gaze, and rode away, leaving behind a silence even heavier than before. Elijah watched them go, his jaw tight. He knew Prescott was right about one thing: he couldn't fight the state alone, not indefinitely. He needed help, allies, people who understood that sometimes the law and justice were two entirely different paths. That evening, after a supper eaten in near silence, Annie asked, "What will we do?" "Elijah." He looked at her, at the trust in her young, worried face. "We fight," he said simply, "but not just with guns." The next morning, he rode out. He left Annie with the rifle, enough food and water, and strict instructions to stay inside and trust no one. His first stop was the hardscrabble ranch of Eli Monroe, an old Army scout he'd ridden with years ago. Monroe was a cantankerous, tobacco-chewing hermit, as tough as worn leather, but with a fierce, unshakable sense of right and wrong. Elijah found him shoeing a mule, the air ringing with the clang of hammer on iron. He laid out Annie's story, plain and unvarnished. Monroe listened, occasionally pausing to spit a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dust. When Elijah finished, Monroe straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow with a grimy forearm. "Them Hales," he rasped, his voice like gravel, "always did think they owned the whole damn county, Sky included. And that Prescott fella, I know his type. All ink and paper. No damn sense of what's human. Desk warm and tick, feedin' on the letter of the law and starvin' its spirit." He fixed Elijah with a shrewd look. "All right, Cole, I'm in. Not for you, you stubborn old goat. You can fight your own damn battles. I'm in it for the girl. Child deserves a damn sight better than what those buzzards would give her. She deserves a patch of ground to stand on, and some peace." It was a start. Elijah rode on to the forge run by the Olsen brothers, two brawny Swedes whose father Elijah had helped during a bad winter. They listened, their faces grim, and promised to be there with hammers and tongs if it came to it. He visited Martha Evans, a widow whose small ranch bordered his own, a woman whose husband had died fighting alongside Elijah in a skirmish with rustlers years back. She offered food and a promise to keep an eye out and spread the word amongst other smallholders who'd had their own run-ins with the Hales' high-handedness. Back at the ranch, a new plan began to form. Prescott and his kind, they understand paper, Elijah told Annie, "So we'll give him paper." With his patient guidance, Annie began to write. Short, simple letters in her careful, newly practiced hand. She told her story. The fear, the bruises, the brief, fragile hope she'd found. She wrote of Jasper's cruelty, of the sheriff's indifference. They sent the letters to the circuit judge, to a crusading newspaper editor in Austin that Mary Beth had sometimes read, even to the governor's wife, on the off chance a woman's heart might be moved where a politician's wouldn't. Each letter was a small seed of hope, planted in the arid soil of indifference and corruption. Whether any would take root, Elijah didn't know, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't just fighting against something. He was building, and beside him, Annie, no longer just a victim, was finding her own voice, her own strength. The shadows were still there, deep and menacing, but now, at least, there were a few candles lit against the dark. The uneasy peace was short-lived, as Elijah knew it would be. The first signs were small, insidious. A section of his north pasture fence was found cut, the wire snipped clean, his meager herd wandering towards the open range. Then, one of his best cows, a young Hereford, heavy with calf, was found shot dead, killed from a distance by a rifleman who hadn't even bothered to butcher the meat. A senseless, wasteful act of malice, designed to bleed him slow, to unnerve him. Worse were the whispers that began to snake through redemption. Slithering from the dark corners of the saloon and the mercantile, Jasper Hale, though not seen, had his tendrils everywhere. Elijah Cole, the stories went, was a crazy old hermit who'd abducted a young girl, that he was touched in the head from grief, that Annie was a delinquent, a runaway thief he was harboring. The poison spread, turning neutral faces cold. Suspicious? Elijah felt the isolation keenly, but it only hardened his resolve. Annie, when she heard snippets from a nervous delivery boy bringing supplies, paled but said nothing, her chin just a little higher. Then came the fire. It was a moonless night, the kind where the stars blazed like chips of ice in an ink-black sky, and the prairie held its breath. Elijah, Annie, and Eli Monroe, who had taken to staying at the ranch most nights, were asleep. A sudden, violent whoosh ripped the silence apart, followed by an angry orange glare that painted the inside of the cabin walls. The barn? Elijah was on his feet before the first shout, grabbing his shotgun. Monroe, a light sleeper from years on the trail, was already at the window, rifle in hand. "Fire! They fired the goddamn barn," he roared. Outside, the scene was hellish. Flames clawed at the dry timbers of the barn, leaping high into the night, showering sparks like malevolent stars. The terrified whinnies of the horses, trapped in the adjoining corral, cut through the roar of the fire. Figures darted in the shadows beyond the ring of light. At least 4 or 5 of them. A muzzle flash winked from the darkness. Then another. Bullets thudded into the cabin walls. "They ain't trying to take anyone," Monroe bellowed, ramming a fresh cartridge into his rifle and returning fire. "They mean to burn us out. Every last thing." Elijah threw open the door, the heat searing his face. "Annie, stay down. Monroe, cover me. We gotta get those horses loose." He sprinted towards the corral, the shotgun bucking in his hands as he fired towards the shadowy figures. One yelped and stumbled back. The heat from the burning barn was intense, the air thick with smoke that choked the lungs. He reached the corral gate, fumbling with the latch, his eyes stinging. Another volley of shots kicked up dust around his feet. Behind him, Monroe's rifle cracked methodically. Annie wasn't cowering. Elijah caught a glimpse of her in the cabin doorway, her face pale but set. She wasn't holding the rifle he'd taught her to use. Not yet. Instead, she was methodically reloading Monroe's spare Spencer, her small hands surprisingly deft amidst the chaos. Her fear a palpable thing, but overridden by a desperate, focused courage. She'd even dragged a heavy sack of flour near the door, ready to try and smother any sparks that landed on the cabin roof. The horses, mad with fear, were difficult to manage, but Elijah finally got the gate open, slapping their rumps to send them galloping out into the relative safety of the open pasture. He turned back towards the inferno, the crackle of flames and gunfire, a symphony of destruction. 2 of the Olsen brothers, alerted by the distant glow, came riding in hard, rifles blazing. adding their considerable firepower to the defense. One of the shadowy attackers, emboldened, made a rush towards the cabin, a burning torch in his hand, clearly intending to set the house alight. Before Elijah or Monroe could draw a bead, a shot rang out from the cabin doorway. Sharper, lighter than Monroe's rifle, the attacker screamed, clutching his leg, and dropped the torch, scrambling back into the darkness. Elijah stared. Annie stood in the doorway, the Winchester still smoking in her hands, her face a mask of terror and fierce determination. "We have to fight back," she cried, her voice trembling but resolute, the words almost lost in the din. "We have to." A surge of something fierce and protective, mixed with a profound, aching pride, swelled in Elijah's chest. This child, this waif he'd taken in, was standing her ground, fighting for her life, for their home. "Damn right," he yelled back, his voice raw. "They've gone too far. Now we show 'em the consequences." He pumped another shell into his shotgun, the rage a cold, clear fire in his veins. The fight was short, brutal, and desperate. With the arrival of the Olsons, the odds had evened. The attackers, clearly not expecting such stiff resistance, and perhaps unnerved by the accuracy of the defenders' fire, began to fall back, their shots becoming more sporadic. Soon, they melted back into the darkness from whence they came, leaving behind the roaring inferno of the barn and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The barn was a total loss, a glowing skeleton against the night sky. But the cabin, thanks to their desperate efforts and Annie's quick thinking with the flour sacks, was safe. One of the Olson boys, young Sven, had taken a bullet in the fleshy part of his arm, bleeding but not life-threatening. The horses were safe. Though spooked, they were all exhausted, smoke-stained, hearts still pounding. But no one was broken. If anything, the attack had forged them closer, hardened their resolve into something like tempered steel, while Monroe and the elder Olson brother checked the perimeter for any lingering threats. Elijah helped Annie tend to Sven's arm. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, her movements efficient as she cleaned the wound with whiskey and bandaged it tightly with strips of clean linen Elijah found. The girl who'd flinched at every sudden noise now faced spilled blood and the aftermath of violence with a quiet competence that amazed him. Elijah watched her, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tied off the bandage. "You've truly grown up, Annie," he said, his voice rough with emotion. She looked up at him, her eyes, shadowed with exhaustion, met his. A small, tired smile touched her lips. "Because I have a reason to be strong now. Mr. Elijah," she said softly, "you, all of you, gave me one." He knew then that there was no turning back, hiding, waiting, hoping the law would somehow see reason. That was over. Jasper Hale and his backers, whoever they were, had shown their hand. They wanted him gone, Annie taken, and they were willing to kill to achieve it. "Monroe," Elijah said, as the old scout returned, his face grim. "This changes things. We can't just sit here and wait for them to pick us off or burn us out. We gotta take the fight to them. We need more men. We need to show this whole damned county that we won't be bullied into the ground." The next day, Elijah and Monroe rode out again, their faces set, their message urgent. They didn't just ask for help this time. They recounted the night attack, the deliberate attempt to murder them all. They spoke of Annie's courage, of the Olsons' bravery. They called for unity, for a stand against the tyranny of the Hales and the silent complicity of those too scared to speak out. Some listened with fear in their eyes, murmuring apologies about their own families, their own vulnerabilities, and turned away. Elijah didn't blame them. Fear was a powerful master, but many others, men and women who had felt the Hales' heavy hand, or who simply believed that a man had a right to defend his home and protect an innocent child, listened with a growing anger. Small ranchers, a blacksmith from a neighboring settlement, even a few storekeepers in Redemption who were tired of Jasper's unofficial taxes and threats. They pledged their support. Some offered guns, some food, some simply their presence. Elijah's ranch, once a place of solitary grief, began to transform. It became a small, bustling hub of defiance. Men worked to clear the charred ruins of the barn, their faces grim but determined. Others helped fortify the cabin, reinforcing doors and windows. digging makeshift trenches around the perimeter. Women brought what food they could spare, organizing a communal kitchen. There was a sense of purpose, of shared struggle, that Elijah hadn't felt in years. It was a fragile thing, this alliance, born of desperation and a flicker of hope. But it was real. It was inevitable that Jasper Hale would hear of it, and he didn't wait long to respond. He rode up to the ranch one afternoon, not with the sheriff or Agent Prescott this time, but with a half-dozen hard-faced men, hired guns by the look of them. Jasper himself was dressed in a new, ill-fitting suit, a mockery of respectability. He'd been appointed interim circuit judge, a move clearly orchestrated by Prescott to give his harassment a veneer of legality. But there was nothing legal about his demeanor now. This wasn't an officer of the court. This was a gang leader come to intimidate. Well, Cole, Jasper sneered, his eyes, small and piggy, taking in the new defenses, the armed men standing ready. Quite the little fortress you're building, turning this hovel into a regular den of rebellion. Are we? His voice dripped with sarcasm. The governor won't stand for this. You know, not for long. Be smart. Hand over that thieving brat of yours before it's too late for all of you. Elijah stood on the porch, flanked by Monroe and one of the Olsen brothers, his shotgun held loosely at his side. He looked Jasper up and down, his gaze filled with a cold contempt. This is our home, Jasper, Elijah said, his voice steady and clear, carrying to every man present. And we'll defend it. As for your governor, if he only listens to lies whispered by vermin like you and that paper-collar Prescott, then he's the one with the problem, not us. Before Jasper could retort, Annie stepped forward, moving to stand shoulder to shoulder with Elijah. The Winchester rifle was in her hands, held not with the clumsiness of a novice, but with the grim confidence of someone who knew how to use it. Her eyes, clear and unwavering, met Jasper's. I belong here, she said, her voice ringing out, surprisingly strong. With these people, they are my family now. You will never take me. Jasper's face contorted with rage. The sight of the girl, once so easily cowed, now standing defiant with a rifle in her hands, clearly infuriated him. He looked like he wanted to order his men to open fire, but something in the united, determined stance of Elijah's defenders, the glint of sunlight on multiple rifle barrels, gave him pause. He spat on the ground. Just you wait, Cole, he hissed, his voice venomous. You and that little bitch will regret this day. You'll all regret it. He wheeled his horse and, with his hired thugs, galloped away, leaving a trail of dust and impotent fury. Elijah watched them go, then looked at Annie, at Monroe, at the faces of the men and women who had chosen to stand with them. The price of courage was high, and they would all likely pay more before this was over. But as he looked at Annie's determined face, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it was a price worth paying. The wind, usually a restless tormentor, seemed to hold its breath. The Texas prairie, stretching out under a vast, indifferent sky, felt like a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The news had come galloping in on a lathered horse ridden by Silas, the perpetually nervous storekeeper from Redemption. His face, usually the color of old parchment, was ashen. Elijah, they're coming, he'd gasped, nearly falling from his saddle. Agent Prescott. He went straight to the governor, stirred up a hornet's nest about insurrection, defiance of state authority. They've mustered a troop of territorial rangers, regulars, not just Hale's usual rabble. They aim to make an example of you to take Annie by force and pacify this area. Silas had thrust a canteen of water at Elijah, his hand trembling. God help you, Cole, God help you all. A grim silence had fallen over the small, fortified community at Elijah's ranch. The men and women who had thrown in their lot with him exchanged hardened glances. This wasn't just Jasper Hale and his thugs anymore. This was the state, with its impersonal might and its trained soldiers. This time they'll be more numerous, better armed, and likely better led than that peacock Prescott. Eli, Monroe observed, his voice a low rumble as he checked the action on his Spencer. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. It's gonna be a long, bloody day, Cole. Odds ain't in our favor. Elijah nodded, his gaze sweeping over the determined faces around him. The Olsen brothers, their blacksmith's strength now bent to the grim task of defense. Martha Evans, her face etched with worry but her hands steady on a shotgun. The handful of other ranchers and settlers who'd had enough. And Annie, standing beside him. No longer a frightened waif, but a young woman with eyes that had seen too much, yet held a fire that wouldn't be quenched. "We fight not just for Annie," Elijah said, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. "We fight for the right to draw a breath on our own land without some tin-star bully or paper-collared politician telling us how high to jump. We fight for the idea that justice ain't just a word in a fancy law book, but something a man can build with his own two hands and defend with his life if need be. Whatever the outcome of this day, we'll show 'em. We'll show 'em all that free folk don't break easy." The hours before dawn were thick with a tension that was almost palpable. Elijah found Annie standing on the small rise overlooking the ranch, the faint pre-dawn glow silhouetting her against the eastern sky. Below them, figures moved with quiet urgency, checking firing positions, distributing ammunition, the metallic click of rifles being loaded a stark counterpoint to the chirping of crickets. "You scared, Mr. Elijah?" Annie asked, her voice soft, almost lost in the vastness. He stood beside her, looking out over the land that had drunk his sweat, his tears, and now, perhaps, his blood. "Fear's a part of being human, Annie," he said, his gaze distant. "It's a companion, whether you invite it or not. But courage ain't the absence of fear. It's looking that fear square in the eye and doing what needs doing anyway. And today, Annie, we're gonna be courageous, all of us." She was silent for a moment. Then, "They'll never understand. Will they? What we're really fighting for? Likely not," Elijah conceded, a wry, sad smile touching his lips. "Most folks only understand what they're told to, or what lines their own pockets. But that don't matter a damn. What matters is that we understand, that we know the worth of what we're defending." He put a calloused hand on her shoulder. A brief, firm pressure. "You've come a long way, child." "You showed me the way," she whispered, as the first blood-red streaks of dawn painted the horizon. They came, not with the wild, disorganized rush of Jasper's thugs, but with the grim, disciplined advance of trained men. Agent Prescott, looking incongruous in his city suit on horseback, directed them from the rear. Sheriff Hale, his face a mixture of smugness and apprehension, rode beside him. The rangers spread out, a tightening noose around the small ranch. The first shots were probing, testing the defenses. Then, with a bugle call that sounded alien and jarring in the prairie stillness, the assault began in earnest. They attacked from three sides, a relentless wave of gunfire and advancing figures. Elijah fought like the old lion he was, his movements economical, deadly. Each shot from his Winchester was aimed, deliberate. He'd seen war, knew its brutal calculus. Beside him, Eli Monroe was a whirlwind of action, his Spencer cracking, his curses a colorful litany against the enemy. The Olsen brothers, their massive frames providing cover, laid down a withering fire. Martha Evans, surprisingly, was a crack shot, her shotgun barking defiance. And Annie was a revelation, perched in a small, fortified dugout they'd prepared. She was a deadly sharpshooter. Her fear was visible, a taut line around her mouth, but her hands were steady, her aim true. More than once, Elijah saw a ranger falter and fall, a victim of her Winchester. But it wasn't just her shooting. In the lulls, her voice, clear and strong, could be heard, shouting encouragement to the others, a small beacon of defiance in the storm of lead. Hold the line. Make every shot count. We can do this. The battle raged for hours. The sun climbed high, beating down mercilessly, the air filled with the acrid stink of black powder, the screams of wounded men, the constant, deafening roar of gunfire. There were losses on their side. Young Sven Olsen took another bullet, this one in the chest, and went down, his brother Lars roaring in grief and rage as he continued to fire. Martha Evans was grazed on the cheek, blood streaming down her face, but she merely wiped it away and reloaded. The defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, but they fought with the ferocity of cornered wolves, exacting a heavy price for every inch of ground. Then, in a moment of chaos, as the main ranger force seemed to be regrouping for another push, Jasper Hale saw his chance, slimy coward that he was. He'd been lurking at the edges of the fight. Now, he made a desperate, scrabbling rush towards a weakened section of the perimeter, his eyes fixed on Annie, a crazed, obsessive glint in them. He clearly intended to grab her, to use her as a shield or a bargaining chip. Elijah saw him. With a roar that was pure, primal fury, he leaped from his position, intercepting Jasper just as he reached the outer trench. The two men crashed together. Jasper was younger, quicker, but Elijah was fueled by a righteous rage that lent him inhuman strength. They wrestled in the dust, fists flying, grunting with effort. Elijah's age told, but his lifetime of hard labor and the burning will to protect Annie evened the odds. He landed a brutal right that sent Jasper staggering back, blood spurting from his nose. "You won't win, Cole," Jasper shrieked, breathless, clutching his broken face, terror and malice warring in his eyes. The law is on my side. The governor himself. Your law means nothing here. You snake." Elijah snarled, advancing on him, his face a mask of cold fury. "This is where your kind of law ends." Jasper, seeing the murderous intent in Elijah's eyes, fumbled for the pistol tucked in his belt. But before he could draw it, a clear voice cut through the din. "It's over." Jasper. Both men froze. Annie stood not 10 feet away, her Winchester leveled, its muzzle unwavering, pointed straight at Jasper's chest. Her face was smudged with gunpowder and dirt, her eyes blazing with a cold fire that mirrored Elijah's. "Back away from him. Now, unless you want your next breath to be your last." Jasper stared at her, at the girl he had terrorized, now holding his life in her hands. His bravado crumbled. He saw no fear in her eyes, only a chilling resolve. Slowly, he raised his hands. The sight of their supposed prize turning the tables, coupled with the unrelenting, costly resistance from the defenders, seemed to break the spirit of Prescott's remaining forces. Losses were mounting. This wasn't the swift, decisive action they'd been promised. Agent Prescott, his face pale and his suit now covered in dust and sweat, seeing his carefully laid plans unraveling into a bloody stalemate, finally gave the order. The bugle sounded again, this time a ragged, hesitant call for retreat. The Rangers fell back, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead, their disciplined lines broken and disordered. Silence, when it finally fell, was deafening. The ranch was a wreck. Smoke curled from smoldering timbers. The ground was littered with shell casings and the debris of battle, but they had held. The survivors, caked in grime and blood, stood amidst the devastation, weary to the bone, but victorious. Eli Monroe, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, limped over to Elijah and clapped him on the shoulder, a grin splitting his dirty face. "We did it, you stubborn old bastard," he rasped. "We actually did it." Elijah didn't speak. He turned and walked towards Annie, who was lowering her rifle, her body trembling with reaction. He pulled her into a fierce embrace, and for a long moment, they just held each other, both of them shaking, tears tracing clean paths through the grime on their faces. "You're free, Annie," Elijah choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "You hear me? You're free. Ain't nobody ever gonna take you away again." Annie clung to him, her face buried in his chest. "We did it." "Bah," she whispered, the word, so long unspoken, finally coming naturally, a healing balm on old wounds. "We did it." The sun, now high in the sky, seemed to bless the battered ranch. They tended their wounded, gently carried Sven Olsen's body to lay beside the two other defenders who had fallen. The cost had been grievous, but as they gathered around a small, sputtering fire that evening, sharing what little food and water they had, there was a sense of profound peace, of a hard-won future. Elijah looked at the faces around him. Monroe, the remaining Olsen, Martha, Annie, the few others. "We paid a heavy price," he said, his voice hoarse but strong. "But we've won more than just a fight. We've won the right to decide our own lives, to live with dignity. What happened here today? Let it be a reminder to any who think they can trample on the freedom of others, that there are still those who will stand against them." He paused. Then a faint, weary smile touched his lips. "We'll rebuild. We'll build it stronger." He looked out towards the vast, silent prairie, now bathed in the soft light of dusk. Sometimes, he said, his voice dropping, as if speaking to the land itself, or perhaps to ghosts only he could see. Justice don't come knocking on your door. Sometimes you gotta hunt it down, wrestle it to the ground. You gotta fight for it, with everything you got, your heart, your mind, your blood. And when you're fighting for what's truly right, for the folks you love, well, you find a strength you never knew you possessed. The last light faded. Elijah sat with Annie by the fire, her head resting on his shoulder. Around them, a small, battered community, forged in the crucible of violence and bound by shared loss and a fierce, protective love, began the slow, arduous task of healing, of rebuilding. The future was uncertain, a trail disappearing into an unknown horizon. But as the first stars pricked the darkening sky, there was hope, a quiet, stubborn, resilient hope, as tough and enduring as the Texas land itself. They had faced the fire, and they had walked out, together,